Welcome to the AAK podcast, brought to you by All About Kids, the leading provider of children's therapeutic and educational services in New York. This podcast will dive deep into discussions on children's developmental needs and the stories of parents and other adults who have dealt with developmental disorders. Each conversation on this show is an extension of our mission to create a world where all children have access to intervention, allowing them to live a full and rich life without restriction, where parents have access to the information and training they need to support their child's therapy and special education needs, and where disabilities, therapy, and special education can be openly discussed without stigma. This time on the All About Kids podcast, I sit down with Sandi Lebenns-Mosher, the ABA Program Supervisor at All About Kids. This is part 2 of a multi-part series on ABA that picks up right where we left off on episode 1. You can go back to the last episode of the All About Kids podcast if you'd also like to tune into part 1 covering the foundations of ABA. On part 2, Sandi and I get into the 4 functions of behavior, the first then statement, the importance of catching your child being good, the 5-to-1 rule, and much more. I'm Zach, your host of the All About Kids podcast. To support the show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. Without further ado, please enjoy this deep dive on ABA Part 2 with Sandi Lebenns-Mosher. Sandi Lebenns-Mosher, thank you for joining me for ABA Round 2.
Yes, here we go. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, of course. It's always good to be on the All About Kids podcast. So last time, I wanted to recap for people what we did for ABA round 1, and I'll link the first round conversation in the description wherever you're watching or listening to this so you can go check it out. You don't have to listen to it in order, but if you want to get some more detail on the references we're making in this episode, you can go back and check it out. And we spoke about in episode 1, just to recap, what is ABA therapy? We went into teaching parents how to be detectives and gave examples of that, how setting affects behavior, visual learning, 4 functions of behavior, which we previewed last time, and we're going to get into that today in greater detail.
Yes, we are. So let's begin with those 4 functions of behavior, because we cannot properly intervene with any behavior if we are not understanding where it's coming from. So, it's not like a cookie cutter kinds of cookbook scenario where, he's hitting, this is what you do. We really have to look deeper to see, why is he doing it? It's almost like like an iceberg. When we see an iceberg, we see the ice, on the top, but under the water is this whole big other mess down there that's much bigger than what we see. And it's the same for behaviors. The behavior that we see on the surface is just what we see. It doesn't tell us about why it's happening. And so that's why I teach parents to be detectives. We have to figure it out. And that's why we have to look at those 4 functions of behavior. The 4 functions are, sometimes it's escape. Children are trying to escape a demand or escape a situation. Sometimes it's for attention. They're trying to get attention. Sometimes it's for a tangible. They're trying to get something tangible. It's their favorite toy or their cookie, and behaviors are coming out for that reason. Sometimes it's sensory in nature, where their bodies are craving some sort of sensory input, and so the behaviors are coming out that way. They may be constantly putting themselves under the cushions, or maybe jumping up and down on the couches, and their bodies are craving something. While we always have to rule out any medical issues that might be happening at first, and while technically it's not a function of behavior, it's something that we have to look at the very first. Let's make sure they are not sick, make sure they don't have an ear infection, make sure that maybe it's a function of they didn't sleep well last night and they're more cranky, or they're hungry, so those could be fixed easily. There's no amount of positive reinforcement that can really help those situations.
Yeah, so getting into the 4 functions specifically, escape, you said escape, attention, tangible, and sensory. And I wanted to get into a couple of those in greater detail. And so I just want to make sure for me I'm understanding it correctly. So when we are talking about escape, that first function, is that the child attempting to remove themselves in some way or get away from punishment or distraction, something that they find unpleasant? What does it mean for a child to be engaging in escaping?
Right. So it's much of what you said. They are trying to escape whatever's going on around them. If you've asked them to come here and clean up your toys, they're headed the other direction. They don't want any part of that. Sometimes it's a function also, it could be of a sensory thing, that fight or flight maybe gets activated and they're just like off and running. It's escaping any demands that's placed on them, or, sometimes skills are maybe too hard for them. And so, being that it's too hard, they don't want any part of it. And their way of dealing with it is to escape it.
Okay, and then attention is in a way the opposite of that. They're not trying to escape something. They're trying to get attention on themselves, or they're trying to get the attention of an adult to draw eyes onto what they're doing, the child is doing.
Sure, it happens all the time when, and
Yeah.
when a family has several children, you're giving attention to the other children, and you're, the youngest one who's having a behavior. It could be because mom's paying attention to the other children. And so their way of getting that attention back is to maybe throw themselves on the floor, start crying and kicking. And so mom can't ignore that, right? So she's going to come over and give them attention. So it works because the crying and the kicking and whatever's happening on the floor is being reinforced because mom is coming over and giving attention. So that's why we have to kind of look at, where is it coming from? Because in this instance, if it is for attention, then we have to be careful not to give him attention during that moment. That moment is not the moment to give him attention. The attention should be given when he's up and complying and doing what mom wants him to do. That's when we give all the attention. So that's why we could accidentally be reinforcing it. If every time he does that, we are giving him attention, then it's being reinforced and it will
Hmm.
never go away that way.
Yeah, so it's very important to keep in mind not just how you're giving attention, but at what point the adult is interceding to give attention to the child, because it could be interpreted in different ways from the child's perspective, depending on how or depending on when the attention is applied.
Yes, if I always train staff and families that if it's attention seeking in nature, if they're acting out, that is not the time to be speaking to them, giving them attention, giving them eye contact. We're always going to be using our peripheral vision, but we're not going to be looking directly. That's giving them attention. We're just going to be, monitoring with that they're safe, they're okay. But the moments that let's say you want them to stand up and come sit down with you, the moment they comply, that's when they're going to get the attention. That's when we're going to speak to them. That's when we're going to look directly at them and give them verbal praise. So they begin to learn the difference between, okay, when I'm acting out that way, then all attention's cut off, and when I'm doing the right
Yeah.
thing, that's when I'm getting all the attention.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of adults, they never grow out of wanting to get attention and constantly needing attention. They just find more adult ways to do it. So instead of throwing a temper tantrum in the supermarket, you might write a post on Facebook and get all your emotions out. So it seems like this is something that could apply to a broad range of ages and not just children. But of course, it's for teaching children to get out of unwanted behaviors, but there's a lot of things that apply to the through lines of human behavior of all ages.
Absolutely. And it's so funny you should say that, because I am, I deal with behaviors, and how to intercede with them, all day, every day on Facebook. Now that you mention it, when there are people like seeking attention, I do not respond. I do not
Yeah.
say anything. If it's attention seeking, like, you're not getting a comment from me, because that's what they want. And so you're right. It's through the lifespan. It's human behavior and, human nature. So
Yeah, it really is human behavior. Just as a tangent for the social media comments. I've experienced that too in my own personal posts and also posting things on social media for All About Kids. Sometimes you get comments where you can tell that the person is just doing it for attention, or they want a comment, or they want a signifier that you've seen the comment and that you're going to respond in a certain way. So they're trying to get off on the fact that they're getting a reaction to you. And so much of having fulfilling social media reactions, or having fulfilling social media interactions, is to distinguish between which comments are genuine curiosity and which ones are just there to get a rise out of you.
Exactly, exactly. I was just speaking with a provider the other day who reached out to me because she was, what the child she was working with was exhibiting some behaviors, and she wanted to speak to me about it. And she's like, he's scratching me, but I kind of knew it was, for attention, so I just ignore it. I just ignored it, and eventually it stopped. So he's looking
Mm,
right at her. He's scratching her, kind of looking at her with that, like, what are you going to do about it kind of thing, kind of face.
yeah.
He's not saying it, but when she's not paying any attention to it because she knew it was attention in nature, he eventually stopped and started doing his work. So it's truly important, and that's how we get the behavior. If on the other hand she had said, stop scratching me, and kept giving attention either verbally, physically, by removing his hands, and redirecting him back to the work, that would have prolonged the behavior. So
Mm.
it's really crucial on how you intervene once you know what that function is.
Yeah. And before we move on to some more specific examples, could you clarify the difference between tangible and sensory? Because to
Sure.
someone like me who's not an expert, tangible sounds like it could fall into sensory, but it's two different categories. What are the differences between those functions?
Something tangible is just something, just anything. It could
Mm,
be anything tangible. So like a toy, a cookie, anything that they're trying to gain access to. So sometimes there's behaviors like I'll work with a family and they're like, Johnny just keeps like climbing on the counters, and
mm,
she can't figure out why. Why does he keep climbing on the counter? So I will observe, like, what is he trying to gain? What is he trying to get at? Well, the cookies are up there in that cabinet. So sometimes it's something tangible, something just that they want access to, and they sometimes may not have a means of communication because like 40% of the children and individuals on the spectrum don't have language. They are nonverbal. And so if they don't have that means of communication, then that's the only means they know. I'll just go get it myself. Let me just climb up here, and get the cookie or the favorite toy that's up there. So it's important to also observe what they're trying hard to get to, so that those could be some things that we can manipulate. Maybe we, bring the cookies down or the favorite toy down where they could have better access to it. But also with that is teaching them a functional means of communicating, of requesting it. So it's not just having free access because that's just not realistic. We can't have cookies all day, every day, but we can learn how to request them, right? So that's also another big part of, how to reduce behaviors is a lot of times it's that functional communication really isn't in place. And so that's also, it goes hand in hand. The better, the more we teach the children how, and individuals, I mean, it's not just children, but because I work with children, I always say that. When we work on teaching them how to better, request or have a social interaction, you will see that those behaviors then minimize. Then there's no more reason for them, and so they begin to minimize.
And speaking of unwanted behaviors, we messaged offline about some behaviors possibly being confused with aggression. Could you walk me through that example that you messaged me, the Johnny wanting a toy and
Yeah.
acting in a way to get it, and how a parent could intervene to not get rid of the unwanted behavior, but just to show a different path to the child, how you can teach your child to want to get things in a different way.
Absolutely. It happens all of the time. Many of the preschools that I go to and families I work with that have siblings, it's some and if the children are not yet very verbal, I'll walk into a class and the teacher's like, Johnny's always hitting. Like whenever it's playtime, like he's always hitting, he's always grabbing toys. And again, going back to that iceberg scenario, that's all they're looking at, right? What the behavior looks like. So that's what they're telling me. What I'm thinking is, Johnny can't really ask for a turn. He can't ask so and so to, can I have a turn with that toy? That looks pretty cool. And so his means of gaining access to that is to swat at Johnny, to get the toy. Maybe the toy falls down on the ground and then he does get it. So that just worked for him. The peer that had the toy walked away. So that total scenario just worked for him. So that behavior has been reinforced, and he's learned in his mind that's how I get a toy. Okay, so we have to teach him now. We have to first identify that that's the root. It's that lack of social skills that has to be taught. Whether or not they have language, I still go through the same process. So I would then teach the classroom teacher, teach the parent, whomever I'm working with, the teacher assistants in the room, that we need to work on those social skills right in the moment. So a lot of times, because they see the acting out behavior, sometimes what the consequence is, what happens after the behavior is, they sit Johnny out because you just hit so and so, you have to sit here and like think about what you did, kind of thing, but that's not teaching him anything, So I say, teach him in the moment. What he wanted was a toy. Let's reset that. Let's use the peer. Let's prompt them both through the scenario of how they can better navigate that. And so he can then learn how to use this new social skill to gain access to a toy instead of swatting someone for it.
I was gonna say, so it's not a punishment based approach. It's an approach where you're intervening in the moment, like you said, and then you're providing the child with an alternative behavior that's going to be more respectful to his peers.
Absolutely. It's teaching them replacement skills. Punishment, that's not going to teach him anything. It's going to teach him, and if a function happens to be escape, guess what? Now he's getting rewarded with it.
Yeah.
So you really have to think about all angles.
Then you have the opposite end of the spectrum, and to go on an example like food, there are times when I was a kid where I was acting out in a bad way. Maybe I was using aggression, whether it's verbally or physically, to get something that I wanted, like a cookie. And then I was only shown punishment. And so I was met with hitting my brother to get a cookie, with go in your room for 30 minutes, no TV, or something at like detention at school. And I wasn't shown how you should get the cookie. It was just, you did this is bad. So in the mind of a kid, you could easily confuse that as, okay, me wanting food is deserving of punishment. If you don't step in and clarify that, no, it's okay to want a cookie, but you have to, there are better ways to go about it. It's not the desire that's getting you in trouble. It's the way that you went about trying to fulfill that desire.
Absolutely. And sometimes we have to teach right time, right place, right? Maybe it's 9 o'clock at night and it's not a right time to have a cookie. And so we have to work through that and teach them that. Just punishment shouldn't be used as a consequence whatsoever. We need to be teaching what the replacement skill is, what they need to learn to better navigate that situation. And so eventually, with repetition, look, anything that we discuss, it doesn't happen overnight. There is no miracle that once you do this, it will be fixed, and that's that. It takes work, it takes consistency, it takes repetition across the board. So it should be repeated in the school, it should be repeated at home with the siblings. Like everybody has to kind of sort of be on the same page for the child to really gain, that skill. and become proficient in it. But once, I've seen it happen over and over again, and then eventually they are interacting more appropriately with their peers. They are waiting to take turns because they've learned that. I mean, sometimes I've used like timers to give them an indication. In their mind, sometimes they think they're not ever getting the toy back. So by using a timer, okay, I'm going to set the timer. Johnny's going to have the toy for a minute and then it'll be your turn. And so they learn to navigate that, okay, now when the timer goes off, now I get my turn. And then it could go back and forth. So that's one of the strategies I teach, both families and teachers sometimes to utilize. And it's funny sometimes once the kids have learned that strategy, they'll come up to me if somebody hasn't given them a turn. Can you set the timer? Because so and so doesn't want to share with me. So that's when they've really learned it.
Yeah, I could use that trick as an adult, if I don't get something, if someone wants something from me, whether it's cleaning up the dishes or making them a coffee, something like that, and someone set a timer in front of me and said, "Okay, I want this. Here, you have 5 minutes to do that." That would be a pretty effective adult behavioral tool. Seeing the time in front of you ticking down definitely gives you an extra incentive.
Well, and to go off what you just said as well is we have to be careful, not to give anyone directives and like right now you have to clean up. It's important to also build in some warnings. And why I say it now is because sometimes I use timers for that too. So, preparing them for what's going to happen is also a way that we can sometimes reduce those behaviors because I don't like it either. I'm reading a good book and somebody's telling me to take out the garbage right now. Like, I'm not going to like that. But if you tell me, look, in 5 minutes, do you think you could take out the garbage? Okay, I could wrap my brain around that a little bit easier. Same for the kids that we're working with. Sometimes we have to show them a visual timer of the countdown and let them know what's going to be happening next. But again, with consistency and over time, they learn, how to better transition using, these supports that we put in place.
Yeah, it seems like people respond so much better to giving someone a task and then a time frame in which they can complete it, like taking out the garbage sometime in the next 3 hours rather than drop what you're doing right now and take out the garbage. Because I know that I don't respond well to that. I've always something I remember popping into my head when I was a kid was getting told to do something by an adult right now and then wondering, why didn't you tell me this 2 hours ago? Because I could have done it. That like third, it's always you're asked to do it right when you start the thing that you really want to do. So it's like I just sat down to read a book and someone's telling you, okay, go take out the garbage now, when I just sat down, rather than letting you know that, hey, sometime before dinner, take out the garbage. So it seems like the timing of it and the allowance for the kid to be creative with how he or she fulfills the task, letting them do it on their own time and getting it done there'll be a better dynamic, like an adult kid dynamic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, we have to prepare them for what's coming next. Don't forget, kids on the spectrum, they love routine. They love to know what's going to come next. And so by providing them with that, it supports them. And so in a way, we always want to try and be proactive in reducing any sort of behavior. We don't want to be reactive after the behavior starts, like, what do I do now? How do I get rid of this? We always want to look, and that's why it's so important to really look to what the function is so we can maybe modify what comes before that acting out behavior, because if I can change something there to, such as what we were talking about, teaching a social skill, how to better navigate that, if I could teach that up front proactively, then maybe the behavior won't even happen. And also what happens after the behavior typically happens, which, with attention, am I giving attention? Am I not giving attention? That kind of thing, because we don't want to accidentally reinforce that behavior either.
What is a first then statement, and what makes these statements so important?
Yeah. So just as I was saying, it's important for them to know what's going to happen in the routines of their day. And sometimes they don't want to stop something. If they're playing with their favorite truck or whatever, like they could do that all day and they don't want to stop to clean up or to go to grandma's or anything else. But if you provide them with those first then statements, so first, you do this and then you get something that you want. So, so first, let's get dressed, get ready to go in the car, then you can play with your car again. So it's called like the grandma's rule, first you eat your peas, then you get your ice cream. Same scenario. Yeah. You do something that I want, and then you get something that you want. So that is also something that can help reduce behaviors. For some kids, I will produce pictures of first them because remember that they are visual learners and we're not always 100% sure how much of what we're saying they're really understanding. So that if we present a picture first, you're cleaning up and then you can have your car and they can see that in picture, it's, a little bit easier for them to understand and they fight less with a picture. They fight less with a picture than with someone telling them what to do. So that's also a factor.
Yeah, and sometimes pictures can communicate things that you might not even be able to say using your own words. Like, for example, emojis are so communicative in the way that they convey emotion. And you can completely change the conversation over text by adding an emoji, which is an animated picture. And it says things in ways and it enhances the conversation. So I imagine a similar a similar experience or a similar effect may happen with a child if you're showing them something, do this first and then this. A picture may be a powerful tool to help the child understand what it is that they should be doing and what behaviors to stay away from, what behaviors are rewarded or reinforced, and things like that.
Absolutely. And it's also for the reason of we don't want to use, if they're not using a lot of language, we shouldn't be using a lot of language either because their brains aren't able to process all those words. So we don't want to give them a command that's a paragraph long. Johnny, come here, get your shoes on, we're going to grandma's. We don't want to say all those words because in their brain, if they're only at that one word, like they're only saying one word at a time, maybe combining two words, they're not at that sentence length, then we shouldn't be providing them with all that language either. Their brains need time to process, and that's also why pictures are so valuable, is because it's a visual, it shows them exactly what they need to do, and the language is limited. So I'm not saying don't use language. Of course, they need to hear language. We just don't want to overwhelm them with the length of a sentence or a paragraph that their brain can't yet process.
So in a way, the child is informing you how to best respond or how to best parent them for certain behaviors. If your child is saying certain words or they're showing certain interests, maybe it's not verbal yet, but it's visual, you can then use those words, maybe add a little bit on top of it, add incorporate certain interests, whether it's a picture of a TV show character or a fire truck, something that captures their attention, and then you can incorporate those back into what you're trying to convey to them without it being too overwhelming.
Yes, you definitely want, we can provide them with choices. If, they have certain shows that they like to watch, we can have visuals of the different shows. They can make choices that way. Which one do you want? So that's just a short little sentence and then show them visuals and then maybe they can make a choice. And now they're feeling like they have a choice, they have a voice, they're getting to let you know what they want, they're getting their favorite show. Like this is all working for them, which is going along those lines of that functional communication that we were speaking about earlier. By using visuals as well, there's a whole picture exchange communication system that has been used for over 20 years now. And now that there are so many devices and apps and everything, there are versions of that in device and app form as well. So families who have speech therapists who are trained in this, and ABA therapists, as I've been trained in it as well, it also becomes a valuable tool to utilize, so they can use these visuals to then also request and comment and communicate with their families, then again, reducing those behaviors.
At the risk of taking away a primary parenting tool of parents that may be listening to this podcast, I will ask you this. Is it okay to bribe your child for good behavior?
So we kind of touched on this last time. There's a difference between bribery and reinforcement. All right. So when reinforcement is before the behavior even begins, there's no behavior. You're letting them know what's available to them. So you can play with your favorite truck or your favorite puzzle after we get your clothes on or whatever. And so they do their thing, and then they get their favorite whatever it is that they want. That is using positive reinforcement. No behavior was there. Okay. But if now it's time to get dressed because we're going to grandma's house and Johnny's throwing himself on the floor, kicking and screaming because he doesn't want to get dressed, that's not the time that we're going to bring out his favorite toy. That would be bribery. Like, if you get dressed, then you can play with your, favorite toy. Once behavior shows itself, reinforcements off the table. Now we need to, get them in some way. So we may need to physically assist them to get dressed. And once they're calm and have done, something that comply in some way, then they can have their favorite toy. So it's a fine line, but it's an important one to know, both as a classroom teacher and as a parent, because definitely don't want to be bribing kids. They'll always be looking for something bigger and better. You know what I mean with bribery. So you want to maintain that positive reinforcement and be proactive.
Yeah, it does seem like a fine line. So reinforcement, if I were gonna say it in my own words, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'll start with bribery actually. So bribery would be introducing a reward once the unwanted behavior has started. So when the unwanted behavior, like throwing a tantrum, you give them a reward to stop that behavior. That's bribery. But reinforcement would be giving them the option of a reward once they stop the unwanted behavior, or yeah, how is that correct to say?
It's just showing them that they have access. Reinforcement is available once they do whatever it is you want them to do. So let's just say it's putting your shoes on. We're going to, first you put your shoes on. Again, using those first then statements. First you put your shoes on, then you get your favorite car. So no behavior has been demonstrated whatsoever, but something that you want them to do, a directive was given of putting on the shoes. And because Johnny knows that he wants to play with his favorite car and it's available to him, if he just puts his shoes on, he's more likely to do that.
Something I wanted to ask you related to adjusting behavior or rewarding wanted behavior, punishing unwanted behavior. How important is the parent's behavior alongside the child? So, for example, if you make a rule in the house that there are no toys after 7 o'clock, but your kid sees you on your laptop at till 10 o'clock every night, which to them is like an adult toy in their mind. How important is it for you to visually show the kid that you're also following the rules that you've implemented for them or for the household?
Absolutely. I mean, kids are bright. They pick up things that you don't even realize they're picking up. And so consistency is everything. If we are not consistent in what we've set out to do with any of our kids, it's not really going to fall in place. It's if it's inconsistent, then so maybe today it'll be okay, and maybe tomorrow it's not okay, but maybe the third day it's okay. And actually that intermittent kind of reinforcement is one of the strongest. And so that behavior will persist because some days it's okay. Today is not one of those days, but maybe tomorrow, so it's important for families to be consistent with whatever they decide, is to be done with their children and what they're trying to teach them. That's how they're going to learn the quickest. And of course, their own behavior, it would be good to be consistent as well, you
Yeah.
know.
So in fitness, there's this phrase known as a cheat day
Yeah.
where if you're working out, let's say you work out 5 days a week for 6 weeks straight, and at the end of that week you give yourself a cheat day, which means you could eat however much you want, whatever you want. You don't work out that day. Would the same concept of a cheat day apply effectively to the behavior of children? So if you said if you do this for a certain period of time, 6 weeks, let's say, you go to bed, you don't play with your toys for 6 weeks straight after 7 p.m. You follow that rule, and at the end of 6 weeks, you can stay up till midnight to play with as many toys as you want. Does that seem like it could also work for kids at a behavioral cheat day of some sort?
So I'm going to say no, but I will say family life is family life, right? And I'm a mom. I had three little kids. They're all adults now. And I broke my own rules, because as a family, you as a parent, you're sleep deprived. Sometimes you just have to do what you have to do just to get through. Sometimes if you need a little sleep or you have to break your own rule. So textbook wise, I would say no. It would be good to be consistent and not have that cheat day. But in reality, family life is hard. And you have to gauge what's really important in that moment. But if you really are working towards a behavior change, then consistency is the best. No cheat days, though I love my cheat days.
Yeah, it seems like a balance. It's all about the balance, and I've seen many kids throw tantrums in public. I've been there myself many times when I was a kid, and something that I've seen happen multiple times is that a kid is acting out, and an iPad comes in front of their face, and everything completely stops, which could be seen as a form of behavioral bribery. But in those moments, I feel for the parents where, they're on a plane or they're in a restaurant, the kids crying, won't stop, yelling, disturbing other people. And it's like, you can just put an iPad in front of their face and they'll stop. And there are times for that. It seems like, all right, like
Absolutely.
tonight we need this to stop. Like, here's the iPad. After this, we'll talk about it. We'll try to change some things. But for right now, for the next hour, we need you to be quiet, and this is the quickest way to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, we have to be realistic. On a plane, trapped on a plane. Can you imagine being trapped on a plane and a child is crying
Oh
the whole
yeah.
entire time? Like I would give him my iPad. you know,
Yeah.
you have to be realistic and in that moment gauge, what's important. If it's a situation that can be avoided, then I honestly just saw this commercial the other day of one of my pet peeves is that even little 2-year-olds are constantly on their, little phones or
Oh yeah,
devices or
it's
whatever, and
crazy.
they're not exploring the world, and that's how they learn is by, exploring the world. If they're in a stroller and walking with their family, like instead of looking at a device, they should be exploring and seeing and what's happening around them and feeling the winds and they're not doing that anymore. And I actually saw a commercial for they have a device like a holder now for when families are diapering their children, so the phone could sit in here while the whole
Oh my
diapering
god.
process is starting. And I was like this is the time where we're supposed to be in their face and smiling and cooing back at them and talking to them, and it's an important part of development. and we're getting more and more away from that. That's a whole nother like sidebar.
Oh no, yeah, yeah, but it's true. The eye contact and the physical touch and the emotional connection is so important for kids and infants. And when you take that away, when you put an iPad in place, whether it's for the parent to be distracted or the kid, it completely takes away that emotional connection, and it's teaching the kid to be distracted from a very young age.
Right, and not being in tune with their worlds, you know. So in a situation like that, I would say that could be avoided. Like, yes, the child will cry. Most children don't like diapering because they get cold and their clothes are taken off, you know. But we could just interact with them during that time, you know, do it quickly, get them reclothed and on their way. But certainly on a plane, you know, you have to pick and choose what the situation is.
So, going off of the reinforcement, can you talk about catching your child being good? That's also something we messaged offline about. Why
Yeah.
is it important to catch your child being good?
Yes, for many families and classroom teachers, when they have children who are tantruming often, you know, the child hears a lot of don't, stop. You know, they're hearing a lot of negatives. Don't do that. And so we want to make sure that their day, there's like a 5 to 1 rule. They should be hearing 5 positives to every negative. And when kids are tantruming or you know, always into something, they're hearing all the negatives. And when they're quiet and doing something, you know, quietly and not getting into trouble, their parents or classroom teachers sometimes they choose not to say anything because like Johnny's quiet, I don't even want to disrupt that, you know. But it's actually the time where we do want to give them the attention in that moment because they are doing the right thing and label, wow, I love the way you're looking at that book right now. That's such a good job. You know, you want to label it, you want to tell them what they're doing well and give them that positive reinforcement. Sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes it's really hard to find the positive because sometimes kids are just into a lot of things. They go from one thing to another thing. But we have to take those moments and really reinforce any small thing. We want to build up those positive statements over the day so that the negative statements that we give throughout the day that are minimized, they're less.
Oh yeah, that even works on me as an adult. That 5 to 1 positive to negative, and I could tell you right now, and living with my girlfriend, when she tells me things that are good that I do, I notice that much more. Like she's like, "Oh, like thank you for remembering to put the toilet seat down. It makes it so much easier for me at night, so I don't fall in and sit in toilet water." And rather than berate me every time I put the toilet seat up, which happens, and then there are things that I also tell her and communicate to her, but it makes me feel good, and I remember it more strongly whenever I'm told something that has a positive effect rather than berated in the moment for something that has a negative effect.
Absolutely. I mean, we're all like that. You know, if I walk in, I'm very conscious when I'm walking into a classroom to not come in with a negative. You know, I always want to come in with a positive. I just the same as when I'm working with children, I don't want to be viewed at, oh my gosh, she's here now. What is she going to say? I instead want to be viewed as, oh my gosh, she's here. How is she going to help me today? You know, kind of thing. So I always try to find the positives. I'm very conscious about doing that even in an email or, you know, in a personal conversation, even if we have to deliver feedback that might be difficult, you know, always try to pull that positive out first.
Yeah, and going back to social media, it's amazing how much one negative comment can affect your psyche and affect the way that you go about your day, even if you've just read 100 or 1,000 positive comments before that. Hearing something negative, it's so hard to balance the positive with the negative because negative sticks in our minds so much more deeply because of human nature. And so I like that rule because it highlights the importance of remembering to tell people when they do a good job, which I don't do enough. It's, something something that I always, not something that I always regret, but I'm trying to be someone that says things more when I like something, even if it's not just behavior, but if, someone has a shirt that I like, or someone does something cool, to always point it out, because I think we assume that someone who does something well hears that all the time. But I've actually heard conversations with celebrity type people and people that are very good at what they do, that are in the upper echelon of success and in the public eye. And they'll say things like, oh yeah, no one really tells me that I'm good at what I do, because that people just assume that I hear that all the time. But it's actually pretty rare where someone comes up to me and says, oh, hey, I love that song, or hey, that the design is great, whatever it is. So I try to be better about that, and that rule certainly applies.
Yeah, absolutely. We all need that. And especially our kids, the kids that we're working with, they need that too. And so I really do try to remind everybody of that.
As we end off, can you talk about the behavioral change as a progression? Is behavioral change linear? Is it okay for unwanted behavior to spike in the short term in order to have long-term change? How does that work in terms of the actual progression of behavioral change?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, because when we're working on decreasing and improving maladaptive behavior, sometimes we go through, if we've tapped into the correct function and we're working on decreasing that behavior, sometimes we get a spike of that behavior, because they're trying to figure out, well, it worked yesterday. Like, why isn't it working now? So now I'm going to have to up the ante. So now I'm just not throwing myself on the floor and crying. Now I'm kicking. Now I'm hitting. Now I'm throwing things. So they'll just keep upping the ante until that's where consistency comes in again, until they see, like, what's mom's breaking point, what's the classroom teacher's breaking point. When I throw a chair, maybe then they'll intercede and I'll get the attention and I'll get what I want. So that's why it's very important to be consistent. It's important to stick with the plan even when it's escalating. It's actually a signal that you're on the right track if it is escalating. So you have to hang tight and be consistent, and then you will eventually see that the behavior will slowly start decreasing, and then it'll stay at that, pretty much stay at that desired, level. There might be a little, here and there, some blips, because they're always trying, well, maybe now I'll get my way. So it's important to really stick with the plan that you've come up with to decrease that behavior.
Yeah, that's a good lesson in life, that almost any meaningful long-term change comes with some short-term discomfort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And a lot of times teachers will say, well, it's not working. Like, what you told me isn't working because it just got worse. And I'm like, actually, that means we're on the right track. Keep it going. Like, don't stop now, or else you will never, you won't get rid of that behavior, as quickly as we want to.
Is there anything else that you wanted to hit on before we end off?
So I don't think we touched on the sensory component of so I just wanted to quickly talk about that. Sometimes those behaviors could be, the wall, throwing themselves against furniture or the wall, jumping up and down. And so if that is a function of their behavior, then sometimes replacing that. I had children who were jumping on the couches all the time. The parents couldn't get them to stop. And so I'm like, do you have a small, like, trampoline? Let's show her that if you need to jump, let's jump on the trampoline. And so by making that little change, it was, and the parent redirected her every single time from jumping on the couch to the trampoline, that behavior, had decreased because we were tapping into the correct function.
Yeah, so not just pulling away something sensory, but offering a replacement for the
Yeah.
physical output.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Sandi, for joining me on the All About Kids podcast for round 2. There's also a list of resources for the notes that you sent me that I'm going to link in this podcast, and it's also in the previous show notes as well. And again, this is the second ABA focused podcast, so round one will be linked in the description. And thank you guys for tuning in. You can support the podcast by rating us on Apple. You can leave a comment, follow us on YouTube, Instagram at AAKCares, aakcares.com. And we'll see you guys next time. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Zach.
Bye, Sandi.